To find 5%, all we have to do is take that 10% figure and cut it in half. So when I take 7.2 and cut it in half, well, if we take 72, cut it in half, we already knew that was 36. If I insert a decimal in there, that's going to give me 3.6. All right, so there's lots of other things that are easy to come up with in that estimation land that may help us there. But they're going to focus using on 10 and 1%, but use 50 and 5% if you need to. In the example I just used where I talked about finding 15%, doing 10 and then 1 5 times is 6 computations or 6 numbers to be figured there. Whereas if I use 10 and 5% to find 15%, that would only be 2 numbers being put together. So that might save me some time. But again, in all of that process, never did I use a calculator. All right, so let's go ahead now and take a look at the actual questions here. Part A, we're finding 4% of 18. So again, because they're estimating here, they're going to instead have me find 4% of 20, assuming that 20 will somehow be easier to work with. Now, because I'm only finding 4%, I'm not going to spend any time really here talking about 10% because I don't need the 10 to get up to 4. I just need 1 4 times there. So 10% again would move the decimal in 1 time. So that's going to change this 20 into 2. 1% would then move it into the next time. So that would give me 0.2. So 1% of 20 is 0.2. So when we're finding 4% of 20, I've got 4 0.2s here, or 4 times 0.2 if you want to think of it that way. Well, you all know what 4 times 2 is. 4 times 2 is going to give me an 8, and if we stick a decimal in there, that's going to be 0.8. And of course, you can see what we did there. We did 4% equaling the same thing as 4 1%. So 4% of 18 here is going to be estimated to be 0.8. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at B there. In B, 29% of 80. So we do need 10% here. 10% is going to take and move the decimal in 1 time. That's going to give me 8. Now, as you can see what they did here, instead of us finding 29%, they just said, since we're estimating, they just rounded it off to a nice clean 30, which is fine. So really they're doing 30% of 80, or 3 10%. Because, of course, 3 10% would be the same as 30%. Or in this case, 3 times 8, 10% equaling 8, so 3 eighths, which would be 24. Now, the other thing you could do in solving this problem is if you really wanted to do 29%, you could really do that pretty easily, and you could really even work with 80 pretty easily here. What you could do is you could do a 10% and a 10% and a 10% like we did, and then find 1% and subtract it off from the result, because that will give you what you need, 29%. All right, number 4. Tim spent $58 on dinner for his family. About how much money should he leave for a 15% tip? So again, this would be a nice one here where we talk about finding 10% and 5% and 1%. Let's go ahead and do that right away to start here. Since we're talking about $58, 10% would take and move the decimal in 1 time, 5.8. 1% would take and move the decimal in another time, so that's 0.58. 5%, which is in the intermediate step here, again, to find 5%, you just take this guy and cut it in half, divide by 2. So we're taking $5.80 and cutting it in half. Well, maybe you're saying, well, that's not really the easiest problem in the world. Well, let's make it easy then. Let's take the $5, cut it in half. What do you have? Well, if I take $5 and cut it in half, that's $2.50. Now let's take the 80 cents and cut that in half. If I take the 80 cents and cut it in half, what do I have? I have 40 cents. So I have $2.50 and 40 cents. That's $2.90 or 2.9. All right, not really that bad. Okay, so we've got our 10 and our 5 and our 1% figures. Let's see how those get used here in calculating a 15% tip. All right, so what they've done here to start off is they've estimated by changing $58 into $60. So since they're going to go ahead and use $60 instead, let's do that estimation with 60. Okay? So 10% of $60, again, taking and moving the decimal in one time, that's going to give me 6. Now the next thing they're doing is finding 5%. Well, we know to find 5%, we're just cutting in half. So if I cut $6 in half, which is again their estimated figure, they're not using the actual numbers, they're estimating here, that's going to give me $3. And remember, if they needed 1%, which we now don't, but to find 1%, we would just take and move the decimal in another time on this guy. That would give me 0.6. Now realize here there's really two ways to find 15%, and really it's up to you. You can do the 10 and the 5%, which is what they're going to do here in this next step, or you could do 10% and then 1% 5 times, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. What you do is really up to you. All right, so 15%, the 10% figure plus the 5% figure gives me 15%. In other words, 6 plus 3 going together to make $9, meaning Tim should leave about $9 for a 15% tip. What they're talking about here is how they figured out 5%, which is again what we explained. 5% is half of the 10% amount. So you divided the 6 by the 2, and then what they're talking about here, the 10 and the 10% and 5% estimates, well, 15% is the 10% and 5% estimates put together. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the check it out examples here. Number one says use a fraction to estimate 48% of 91. So 48%, that's right close to 50%. And 50%, well, we know about 50%. 50% is the same as 1/2. Right, now, I don't really want to work with 91, but luckily they're saying I can estimate here. So instead of working with 91, that's going to change to 90. So I'm really finding half of 90 here. Half of 90 is 45. And that's going to be my answer. I'm going to estimate 48% of 91 to be 45. And question number 2 here says Billy's office supply store is offering 25% off a leather notebook, originally priced at $9.75. Kay's office supply store offers the same notebook, not on sale, for $7. Which store offers the better deal? So we can get 25% off a $9.75 purchase, or we can get it regular price $7. And we have to figure out which one is the better deal. Alright, so obviously that means we have to do the computation to figure out what we're going to spend at Billy's. Since the K's price is flat, no discount or anything that we need to look at, I don't really have to do anything there, but I do need to make a comparison to it. So, if we're talking about 25% off a leather notebook, we're talking 25% off of $9.75. Well, there's a couple different approaches you can use here. You can use the idea of what we were using up here with some fractions, or you could use the 10%, 5%, 1% idea here. If you're going to go with that 10%, 5%, and 1% idea, you're going to use 10% twice, and then 1% 5 times, or 10% twice and then 5%, whatever you want to do. So let's go ahead and do that here. 10%, and we're going to do a little bit of estimating here. Not that I couldn't work with $9.75, but I can make it probably a little bit better by writing this as $9.80. Now you could probably get away with rounding it to 10, but we can take 98 and work with that pretty easily because that's not going to be too terribly bad. Alright, so 10% is going to take and move the decimal in one time there. So when I move the decimal one time on that, that's 0.98. When I find 5%, well, that's just going to cut this guy in half. So half of 98 cents. Now, if you're having a hard time with that, just think of half of 98 then instead. If I cut 98 into 2 parts, that's 49. Stick the decimal in, 0.49. Alright, so if I'm finding 25% here now, I'm finding 10% twice, which will get me to 20%, and then 5% once, which will get me to 25%. So that's going to be a discount of 98 cents and 98 cents and 49 cents. And luckily, because those are so close, we're going to get away with a little bit of rounding here. I'm going to round that to a buck and 50 cents. And so, in other words, my discount's about $2.50. All right, so if I take this $9.75 price and take off $2.50, now I know what I'm going to pay. And when I do that, I'm going to find out that I'm going to pay $7.25, which is, again, me just doing $9.75 minus $2.50. Well, at K's, it was only $7. So here, in that case, I'm actually paying 25 cents more. So that means the better price is at Billy's. All right, I'm sorry, at K's. By a quarter. All right, here's number 3, using that 1% and 10% idea again, and we're finding 21% of 60. All right, this one's not too bad. 10% again, take and move the decimal in one time. So that's going to give me 6. 1% is going to take and move the decimal in again. So that's going to give me 0.6. So I'm finding 21% here. So that's going to be 10% twice, and then 1%. So 6 and 6 gives me 12, plus a 0.6 is 12.6. All right, number 4. Amanda spent $12 on a haircut. About how much money should she leave for a 15% tip? Well, again, this one we can handle quite easily. All right, let's find our 10% and our 5% this time, since we're finding 15%, and we'll find 1% even though we don't necessarily need it. 10%, I'm going to take and move the decimal in one time, so that's going to give me 1.2. 1%, again, is going to take and move the decimal in another time, so that's 0.12. And 5% is going to cut this in half. Now, if you're having a hard time with $1.20, just think of it as 12 then. If I cut 12 in half, that's going to give me 6, and then put a decimal in there, 0.6. All right, so I'm finding 15%, so that's 10% and 5%. So 1.2 plus 0.6. And again, if you're having a problem with that, just think of it as 12 and 6. 12 and 6 go together to make 18. Stick a decimal in there. That's 1.8. So a 15% tip means she should leave about $1.80. Don't get stuck on the homework tonight here. Don't look at the person next to you and say, hey, you're doing that differently. The way you estimate these things could be different. That doesn't mean your answer is going to necessarily be wrong. That's the nice thing about estimating, is there's lots of ways you can get away with things here and still come up with answers that are reasonable in terms of the context of the problem.